Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast today. A very meta episode. We're podcasting about podcasting. And for this, we have a super expert. We've got Kevin Chemidlin, who's a podcaster and a podcast coach. And he started off in one of my favorite cities, a lot of love for Philly, with his first podcast, Philly Who, which was launched in 2018 as a side hustle while he was a corporate software engineer. But just months after launching, he decided to leave his job and go all in on the podcast. And within 18 months, Philly Who had surpassed 100,000 downloads with more than $140,000 in monetized revenue. And so 2 years after that, in 2020, he began helping other podcasters grow and monetize because he had found this secret sauce. And then he launched Grow the Show, a podcast, and the Grow the Show Accelerator, an extensive podcast accelerator program. And since then, his show has amassed an audience of 30,000 plus. And the Grow the Show Accelerator has served over 400 podcasters, generating multi-seven figures in revenue. And his mission is now to help podcasters like me. Independent podcasters turn their shows into profitable businesses. So, Kevin, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
So excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. This is awesome.
What's the secret sauce? Let's start with that because, I've heard what everyone says is just be consistent. Just go on other shows. Just be, fun and engaging. But lots of people do that and don't seem to get traction. Yep. So what's the difference between those who do and those who don't?
Yeah. So there's four things. Basically what I like to say is there's four things that every podcast that is growing, that has an audience, that is generating revenue somehow, so it's monetized, has going for it. And the shows that aren't where they want to be, they're not growing, they're not monetized, are missing one of those four things, okay? Now you mentioned consistency. Everybody talks about how consistency is required, and that is true. But there's a lot of podcasters out there who they've been consistent for sometimes over a decade and their show hasn't grown, right? So, and they're like, what gives? I've been consistent. Everybody said just be consistent. And so consistency is table stakes, right? It is a requirement to be successful, but consistency alone is not going to make somebody successful, right?
Yeah.
So not being consistent could be why you fail. Being consistent is not alone going to be the reason you succeed. You need all four of these three things. And they're basically the four skills that any podcaster needs. And I want you to picture a ladder, right? So 4 rungs on the ladder, you got to kind of hit the 4 zones on the ladder. And the reason why we do it that way is because you could have level 3 locked in, like really, really great, really incredibly skilled at level 3. But if level 1 is not sufficient, you will have no results. It'll be like you have nothing, right? So sometimes I discover a podcaster is missing level 1, but they might have levels 2, 3, and 4 in really great shape. We fix 1 and boom, they explode. Yeah. Other times you do have to build the 4. So here are the main 4. The first one is having what I call a clear, unique premise. What that boils down to is who is your show for specifically, right? Who's going to listen to this show? And not demographics. Everybody's like, oh, it's men, women, aged 45. Like, no, it's not that, right? Yeah. We're not Don Draper, right? Like selling ads in the 60s. It's what situation are they in their life, right? Where are they at? Where would they rather be? Who are they? And then what does the show do for them?
Yeah.
And that's the big thing. Like a lot of podcasters are like, oh, I interview successful physicians, where it's like, yeah, that might be what you do, but what do those interviews do for its listeners? If people listen to the show, what are they going to get out of those conversations?
Yeah.
So that's number 1, a clear, unique premise. Number 2 is keeping attention. Everybody's like, oh, how do I get more listeners? And I'm like, hold on. Are you sure that you're keeping the listeners that you already have? And in most cases, podcasters are not. They think they have a growth problem when really they have a retention problem. So they see their numbers are 100 downloads every single week. What they don't realize is 20 of those people are the same, but every week they're getting 80 new people who listen to the show. They're like, this isn't for me, and they leave. So it's like there's a hole in the bucket, right? It's like
there's
trying
a
to fill.
revolving door. Yeah,
Exactly. So you fix that, that's when you can start to see your numbers go up. If you try to grow your show before you stop the revolving door, I can get you 1 million downloads next week, but in 2 weeks, you're going to be back to where you are today because you lost everybody. So that's level 2. Level 3 is growth. That's where you actually get more people into the fold, right? That's when, okay, we know that we have a clear, unique premise. We know that we can get people to stick around once they find the show. Now, how do we get the right people to find out that the show exists? That's it. It's like, how do I grow my podcast? A better question is, how do I get people who would be interested in my show to find out that it exists? And we can go in there's so much to say about how to do that. That's what everybody wants. And then the fourth one, once you have a show that holds people's attention, that's able to grow, then you monetize. And the secret to monetizing, that's the true one that everybody wants. Like, how do I make money off of this? It's simply this. You get your listeners to buy something. It could be something that you sell to the listeners, right? It could be a course, it could be a book, it could be an event that you throw that they buy tickets for, or it could be a product or service that another company sells to them, right? AKA your sponsors, right? Because everybody's like, oh, I want to get sponsors to my podcast. Well, sponsorship is just another company paying you in advance for your listeners to buy their stuff. So it doesn't make sense to worry about monetization until you know that A, you can get an audience, and B, you can get that audience to grow. You can get more people to pay attention to the show.
Yeah.
After that, monetization is just getting those folks to buy something and you getting a cut of that thing. And so those four things, the podcast ladder is number 1, premise, number 2, retention, number 3, growth, number 4, monetization. Once you have all those skills developed, that's when you have a growing, thriving show. It took me 5 minutes to go all that, but it's taken me 5 years to codify all that information into one thing. So it's a little bit more complicated than all that, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
That makes sense. So one of the things that I think that physicians have down is actually the monetization. And I'll explain. Because either you're a physician who's podcasting to other physicians, in which case then your listenership is really valuable. And we've got sponsors. We have sponsors on this show who are looking for a physician audience. So actually, I'm going to plug my network. We're going to be launching something called the Doctor Podcast Network soon. So one of the things that we offer is for the members of our network, we're going to help them get sponsors because they're out there looking for physician ears. Because, anyone who's been to a drug lunch knows it's hard for someone to get a physician's attention so much so that they'll buy the whole office lunch just to get our ear for like 10 minutes. So we've got the attention of physicians that are listening as long as we have a big enough audience, right? So, or you're a patient-facing podcast, in which case then your listeners are your patients. So that's your monetization. You're trying to drive more patient flow. Or as you said, you've got something to sell. You're a coach, you've got webinars, something that you're selling to, or a book that you're selling to physicians that's going to help them. So I think the monetization, but like you said, that's the fourth rung. And I think as a profession, we've got that. It's the other 3 where we need a lot of help.
Everything else, right?
And so, the unique premise. So something that I see a lot of is there are a lot of physician coaches out there, right? They're looking to coach other physicians through, difficult parts in their career. There's a huge epidemic of physician burnout. People are really unhappy with their jobs. And a lot of the times they had coaching themselves and they got themselves out of this hole. And so now they're trying to spread the gospel and help other physicians in the same way. But that's kind of a saturated space, right, of these physician coaches. I'm not a physician coach, but I know a lot who are, right? So if you're trying to figure out your unique voice, right, in that space, how do you find that? How do you identify this is the thing that's different about me without, losing the foundation, which is something that you have common with a lot of other people that this is something you're suffering from. This is something I can help you with.
Yeah. So, So first off, when you already have the monetization tactic down, right, you already know what it is you're going to sell. The rest of the stuff actually is way easier than someone who doesn't know that, because you want to ideally, as much as you can, make the value proposition of your podcast as close to identical as the value proposition of your services or your product or whatever it is as possible. So I say it's podcast product parity is what we look for.
Okay.
So if you take me, for example, my podcast is called Grow the Show. If you listen to that podcast, you are going to learn everything that I know about how to grow and monetize a show. I don't hold any information back, right? Everything that's in my courses, you can find somewhere on the feed. And so for the past, almost 5 years now, every week I put a little nugget out there. The thing is, and there's tons of people who consume the thing and they'll never buy my stuff. And that's great because they tell 10 people and 2 of those people buy the stuff. So it works for me. What people are buying from me is implementation, guidance, right? Discrete steps, organization of the information, a community, just all the different ways that I can help get the outcome that my show promises, which is grow the show. If we're talking a physician coach, for example, the way you asked about differentiation, right? The way that you differentiate yourself, assuming that the other physician coaches have podcasts as well, which I don't know, maybe they do, maybe they don't.
No, there are a lot. There are quite a few out there. Yeah.
Yeah. So in that case, I say you want to point to your method. right? Because when you're a coach, people need to be sold on your method anyway. So my first answer to your question today was my method, right? Those 4 steps. You can go find a podcast out there that probably most of the shows that are on top of the charts have never heard that distinction, those 4 things in that step. They hear it and they'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I've done that. But that's my method for taking somebody from my show, I don't know what I'm doing, it's not growing, to my show is growing and it's monetized. That's my unique method of doing that. If you have a podcast and you have coaching, the way that you differentiate yourself is by making all of your episodes somehow revolve around your method. So if you work with a physician who's super burnt out and you want to take them to point B, which is where they're not burnt out, maybe they're more engaged in their work, they have more time for their family, all the things that these burnt out people want, then every single episode of your podcast needs to help them get one little baby step closer to that. And so what'll happen is they'll start to listen to your method, your way of making that thing happen. And they'll be like, you know what? I really, really like the way this person does this. I like the way that they deliver. I like the way that they talk. I hear from people who are like, I listen to 5 podcast shows. What I like about this one is this. What I like about yours is this. I'm like, great, very cool.
Yeah.
So it's like just in the way that you do things. Am I making sense?
Yeah. I think sometimes what happens is we think we know what the audience's pain points are, but we might be wrong, right? Like, how do we differentiate what our listeners want, what we think they want, and what we want them to want? You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
Those are 3 different things. And so, like, for me, my audience has always been me. I'm podcasting for me. And I figured if I have these questions, other people are going to have similar questions. But if I'm trying to grow my show, I need to figure out what my actual audience wants.
Right.
And how do you figure that out?
Yeah.
Right? Rather than assuming you think you know.
Right. So, I mean, it's about constantly closing the gap between what I think they want and what they want, right? Like it's trying to make that as close to the same thing as possible. And the answer is you interact with these folks. So whenever I work with somebody, they work with me on a one-on-one basis and they're at a point where they're not sure who their audience is before they start, I have them go set up 12 30-minute Zoom conversations with the people who they think is going to be their audience and the people who they think want XYZ. And they set up 12 conversations and they're always like, 12, really? It's going to take 6 hours? I'm like, yes, you have to go do it. I promise you. I have never had one person who have done this exercise, and there's been several hundred, who's come back and said, I think that was a waste of time. Not one of them. And some of them were like 9-figure business owners who I made them clear their calendar, tell their team to F off for 2 days, and they talked to their potential podcast audience, and they got so much clarity because it's just interacting with them. And what happens is some of the stuff that you think they want, they will confirm. Others, you'll be like, wow. My favorite example is, likewise, I guess, audience for me. When you mentioned in the intro, I had a show about my hometown of Philadelphia. I did that for 2 years. And then there was a moment where COVID happened. Not sure if this audience has ever heard of COVID. No, I'm kidding. That happened. Everything went right. Everything went up in the air for a minute. And so my show went on pause. So I was like, okay, now's my chance to impact the podcast world. I've learned a lot. I've achieved a lot. Let me create something that other podcasters can use. So I said, I've got it. I'm going to create a podcast about interviewing skills. I was ready to create the website and build the course and make all the modules. And I was about to do it. And I spoke to a mentor of mine and he was like, okay, that's cool, but just do me a favor. Go talk to some podcasters, 10, 12, whatever it is. See what it is they want help with, right? I was like, okay, fine. I set up 30 conversations with podcasters.
So it's what they want versus what they need. So you recognize after listening to a bunch of shows that there are a bunch of podcasters who do something like this. They interrupt their guest. And so they need help with their interviewing skills. And that's what they need. But you first have to put out there, identify what they want so that they come to you.
And so you can imagine after the 30th call, and not one single podcaster was like, what I really know, you know what I need to do? I need to be a better interviewer. No, they were all like, I know my interviewing is not the problem.
The best. The best. I'm so smart and
I know
funny.
My content's good. I just need, how do I grow and how do I monetize? And I'm like, okay, I get it. The point is they say sell the vacation, right? Don't sell the flight. And so my show is not called Better Define Your Premise, right? It's called Grow the Show. But what do I talk about? Maybe 80% of my episodes are about here's how to understand your audience. Here's how to make good episodes. Here's how to interview. So it's just a matter of, number one, you got to validate that what you think your audience wants is what they want. Yeah. You still need to make it for you. You still need to be excited about it for the creator. But then it's you just sneak in, and I'm sure physicians, I don't know, I would imagine physicians are familiar with the idea of sneak in what they need with what they want, right?
Well, I mean, I think, at least with my interview style, you're going to have someone, and if they're answering what they want to know, there's going to be plenty of content about what they need to know as well. So
Sure.
is inevitably going to get mixed in. But that's not then the audience themselves, right? Who is your audience versus who do you think they are versus who do you want them to be, right? Kind of the same premise, but instead of with the content, now with the audience themselves.
It is. And like, to me, that's more important than the content, right? When you understand who you're trying to reach and what you want, how you want to impact them, what content you make actually becomes really easy. Like it makes a million decisions for you, but it is the hardest part. It's like, who is this for? Anytime a podcaster comes up to me and they're like, how do I grow my show? It's just, who is your podcast for?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, and I'm like, here's your problem. Like, you need to be able to say it's for these people. And it's not easy to do that. And some people do the 12 interview exercises and they're like, I kind of still don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, did you really vibe? And usually it's 3 of the people, the 30 minutes went by in a flash and they vibed like crazy and spoke for 90 minutes. For another 6 people, it was a drag. They're like looking at the clock. When is this time over? And it's like, okay, what's unique about these people? Why did you vibe with them so much?
Yeah.
And then here's the other secret that nobody wants to hear is that it's going to continuously evolve. You're going to evolve as a creator. After 5 years, you're going to be like, I'm tired of talking about the same things. And so do I pivot? Do I talk about something else? So that's just a part of the creator journey. And I think my North Star that I try to share with folks is like, you just got to keep in mind who that person is and stay excited to serve that person. If you stop being excited to serve that person, that's okay. But you got to find someone else that you're excited to serve.
When I first started podcasting, I didn't put anything out on social media. And now what I do is each episode, we take these clips and we repurpose them and we put them out there. Although it seems to me like we're just speaking to the void, right? Like just throwing the content out there. And that's not what people want, right? So social media, it seems like you did that a few years ago. It was a great way to get your message out there. But now that space is saturated. It's not working. But I've heard you talk about social media is useful for something, right? So how do you use social media, or how do you have your clients use it?
Yeah. So the one distinction that I make is what everybody does is what you described, which is like, how do I want to create this podcast episode, that I want to take the episode, rip a bunch of clips out of it and put the clips everywhere else, right? And you're right. In the early days of short form video, that did work because not a lot of people were putting out good short form videos. So like you could grab a clip out of context and it would perform compared to everything else that was being posted, which was just like dancing videos, right?
Yeah.
Well, we've come a long way. Like the market has matured and now you've got like feature film quality stuff, right? Yeah. So, people on short form video, they're just not interested in being dropped into the middle of a conversation. They don't know who's talking. The video quality is not that great. It just doesn't work. So that's why it seems like it's going in the void, because what happens is you post that video, the algorithm very quickly shows it to a couple people. They scroll past it faster than their brains can comprehend that they even saw it because it wasn't immediately really good. And then the algorithm says, well, this clearly was not a good video. Let me never show this to anybody ever again. So that's how that works. The key though, and the way that you can use social media to get the word out about your podcast is, rather than thinking, how can I use social media to promote your podcast? You want to think, how can I use my podcast to participate on social media? Slight mindset shift. But what that involves is looking at by the way, pick one platform. You don't have to be on every platform. Wait until you have a team in order to be on every single platform. Single people generally are not on every single platform. So you pick one, the one that makes the most sense for both your audience and like a platform that you like to be on. What do you scroll? Like, what do you know?
Yeah.
And then say, okay, what do posts on that platform look like? Like what are people posting on that platform? If it's LinkedIn, it's images with text, maybe some videos. Like LinkedIn's starting to get into the video space, but it might be like a PDF of like really, specific knowledge or whatever. So you can use your 60-minute conversation that you have to identify little bits of insights, right? We've been speaking for 20 minutes, and we've probably already said about 10 to 20 little discrete atomic things that would make an excellent post on LinkedIn or an excellent reel by itself on Instagram, right? So you take all the stuff that you're generating in this really long form piece of content, and then instead of just ripping it and throwing it on other platforms, you use the words and the insights and the thoughts and the frameworks and the steps and the stories that you mention in that long piece, and you create native pieces of social media content for that platform. When I say native, I mean it looks like a LinkedIn post. It talks like a LinkedIn post. Like people can't tell out of the gate, oh, this person just ripped a clip from their podcast.
Okay. Yes, that makes a whole lot more sense rather than, hey, I have a podcast. It's like, hey, I've got good content. And they're like, oh, I really like what this person is producing. And then they find you rather than you're trying to cram this episode. Watch this episode, right? You're like,
Right.
hey, I've got some really good information I want to share with you. Boom, there's the information.
Right.
And they're
The
like,
question is,
oh, yeah. Then they go down your rabbit hole and then they find your show and binge watch all your stuff.
before you post whatever it is, you want to say, if somebody sees only this post from me and never anything ever again, and they don't click on anything in the post, will it be useful to them? Will they be happy that they saw it? If the answer is no, it's not going to perform well and it's not going to do what you want it to do. If the answer is yes, it'll perform well. It'll bring you audience. They'll follow you. They'll go down the rabbit hole and then it'll bring you listeners.
Yeah. Is there a pain point I'm solving for? And that's what you focus on. So in this episode, there are going to be a number of things that we'll be able to highlight, and each of them will be a LinkedIn post. That's great. That's great. You also talk about organic viral social media. So is that the same thing that you just said? Like those then become so useful that people are more likely to reshare them and then it goes viral? Or is there something different?
Great. I love that you've done your homework. I love to see it. So yes, and.
Okay.
So
improv. Yes, I like that.
So when I create native social media content from my podcast episodes, I'm not necessarily aiming for them to quote unquote go viral. So I shouldn't use the word viral. It's just organic reach. Like when I post this thing, does it perform so well with the people who already follow me that the platform shows it to people who don't follow me? That's it. Yeah. And then more people see, they follow you, blah, blah, blah. So what I have seen with the clients that I work with and a little bit with my own, I'm a long form guy, so I admittedly don't post all the time on social, but some of the people that I work with are really, really social media people. And so we lean into that for them. And so for them, sometimes they will make a piece of content that is directly derived from their podcast and they get tons of organic reach from it. But there are also folks who just make social media content outside of their podcast, and like the stuff that goes quote unquote viral tends to be something that's been really engineered to go viral. Like they sat down and they're like, let me make a video that goes viral. So I do talk about that, and I'm actually probably going to talk about that a little bit less just because it takes a lot to make that happen. And as more and more people try to do it, like it just becomes harder and harder to do. And what I found is that the people who get the most juice from the squeeze are the ones who do what I said before, which is make a really great piece of long form and then put out good pieces of short form alongside of it. Yeah,
because you're trying to be useful to your audience, whereas the viral, super viral stuff is generally you're trying to be entertaining, not useful. Right. Like that's the stuff that gets shared the most. And those aren't going to be your podcast listeners, especially for, a physician audience.
Right. It's the difference between attention and audience, right? Yeah. So a viral post gets tons of attention, but it does not build an audience because someone just sees the cat jump and then they move on with their lives. They're not like, ooh, let me see more videos from this. Like, they're just like, oh, that was a funny cat video. Gone, right?
Let me share it with someone and then, see what else is, any other cat stuff out there. Yeah.
Audience is someone who keeps coming back to the content that you put out on a regular basis to get more from you.
Is there a role for paid ads? Like, would you ever take some of that content that you were just talking about it, but then intentionally boost it on whatever platform you're on?
So lately, very recently, I've been seeing folks on Instagram specifically put out reels that work really well organically and then putting money behind them. So I've started to see that work. If you asked me this 6 months ago, I would have said absolutely not. If your goal is to grow a podcast, to not do social media ad spend. Even still though, like it's just, there be dragons, right? For most people who don't have experience with media buying on social media platforms, it can be quite the money pit. Yeah. So for a podcaster who's like, I'd like to make this happen faster. I'd like to spend some money on advertisement. I'd first say, how are your completion rates? Is your show keeping listeners, right? Like make sure before we pour kerosene on this thing, right? Make sure that we're good. But usually I'm like, if you do social media ads, what I found is that they perform the best to grow a podcast when the ads are not actually there to grow the podcast. They're there to send people to some sort of sales funnel or some other freebie, right? And then through them entering that funnel or marketing system, they get fed podcast episodes. That can work really well.
Yeah. Grow your email list and then send them the episodes, but don't expect it to directly translate into downloads.
Exactly. And what I'll call out something here is that we're talking about all these different, it's like grow your email list to grow your podcast, grow your social media to grow your podcast, right? And it's like, well, I just want to grow my podcast. And it's like, okay, first of all, I'd say if you want to have a podcast driven business, you really do want to have social media and an email presence. It's a triad that you want to have all three of those things. But say you couldn't and you had some dollars to spend, I would run ads on other podcasts, because in podcast world marketing strategies, it is the most efficient way to reach podcast listeners. Because here's the secret. If you run social media ads to your target audience of physicians, probably 30 to 60% of those physicians don't listen to podcasts. And you're probably not going to get them to start, right? Even if they're the perfect avatar. So 100% of the people that you reach when you run podcast ads listen to podcasts, because that's where you're reaching them.
Yeah.
So again, if I've had people, they're like, look, I'm going to spend $500 on advertising. Tell me where to do it. I'm like, okay, fine. If you must, buy ads on other podcasts. That's what's going to get you, a better result.
Just another plug for the podcast network that we're going to be launching. That's going to be part of the network, actually, is we're going to have these exchanges, not where you interview each other, because that can be cumbersome and take up a lot of your content time. And then it's just Podcest, where everybody is interviewing everybody. It's the same contest over and over, but where we just plug each other. Like if you're part of the network, then there's going to be like a clearly defined rotation where you are plugging each other's podcast. And that's how we help each other to grow each other's shows with, just, hey, check out my friend, Kevin Chemidlin's podcast, Grow the Show. It's awesome. I loved it. I just started listening to it and I binge watched a whole ton of episodes, like just a quick one-liner. And then, because we're all physician to physician, we have the same or similar audiences, and it's going to help us grow. So I love that you said that specifically, because that is going to be part of our winning formula to be part of the network.
Incredible. Amazing. Perfect.
So we mentioned the email lists. That's something else I've heard you talk about, because I hate the email lists, because I unsubscribe all the time myself. I always feel like I'm bothering people. Like I'll spend a lot of time on a blog post and then I feel like I'm just like annoying them. But what I've heard you say is that actually, because you've got this revolving door of listeners, you're reminding them that you're out there, and then they're going to go and they're going to, listen to a few of those episodes just from that simple reminder. So there is a role, and we don't have to worry as much that we're bothering people.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, everybody who has an email list is afraid of overdoing it. Everybody who has an email list is afraid of emailing the list too much, myself included. But what I found is that, number one, we're always so much farther away from the line than we think. People are just not thinking about, it's like, who emailed you today? You don't know, right? You don't have any idea. Like you get an email, it's like, how many times did they email you this week? You don't know. And I'm also somebody who keeps a very clean inbox. Like I am just, if I get anything in there that I don't want, inbox zero, I am just an unsubscribe button warrior. Yeah. And so for me, it took me a long time to understand that not everybody's like that. Like a lot of people, most people aren't like that. Right?
That's my problem. I think everyone's like me, and it's hard for me to realize that people aren't. Yeah.
You and me both. So, that was something that I had to kind of get over as well. And once I did, and I send an email and open rates are 40, 50%. I'm like, this is crazy. And by the way, I just did an audience survey this morning, because I do that annually just to, once again, we didn't mention it before, but keep the pulse on where people are. Every year I do a survey of my audience, and I share the survey link on social, on email, on the podcast feed, on YouTube, wherever anybody can reach me.
Yeah.
Email always has the most people fill it out. It's just where it's where they are. Like when they get an email, they're in a place where they can do something. They can take action. They can buy a course. They can fill out a form. They can click on a link. They can book a time. Yeah. When they are scrolling on social media, they tend to not be as bothered by that. They don't really want to do that.
Not in the same headspace. You might be doing something at the same time, or
right. I'm watching Netflix while I got the sports game on my laptop, and I'm scrolling at the same time. The last thing I'm going to do is buy your course. And then also when people are consuming your long form content, it's even harder for them to take action, because they're usually doing something else while they're listening to it or while they're watching it. Usually it's on the TV and they're listening, whatever, but they're busy. Their hands are full. They're in the squat rack. They're not going to put 240 pounds down and go buy your course on their phone. So that's why email is so powerful for getting people to take action. Your comment on it being a great reminder tool, it's true. One other thing that sucks about podcasting, because there's a lot of them, believe me, I've discovered, I think, all of them by now, is a lot of great things too. That's why I still do it. Is this podcasting is the only medium where we don't have a cumulative score with time of how many people opted into our stuff. So when you have an email list, you get subscribers. The subscriber list grows. Sure, people sometimes unsubscribe, but in general, it grows and grows and grows. And there's tons of people who are subscribers who haven't opened an email from you in years, but they're still there and they still get to count and you're a nice little subscriber. Same thing on social media, right? If you reach 1% of your social media audience, that is generally good. If you reach 3% with a post, that's a phenomenal post, 3%. So there's people who have 100,000 followers who 97% of those followers don't see their posts.
Yeah.
97%. So they're like, ooh, look at me. I have 100,000 followers on social, where it's like, yeah, but 3,000 people see your posts. YouTube is the same thing. I was just looking at a creator recently. He's got 1 million subscribers on YouTube. Now, he's been making videos on YouTube for 10 years. And if you look at all of his recent videos, they get maybe 2,000 views. Now, when you see that guy, you're like, wow, look at that 1 million subscriber YouTube. If that guy was a podcaster, he would not have that 1 million number at the top of his feed. He would be coming to me and saying, why is my show still stuck at 2,000 after 10 years?
Yeah.
This is true for podcasters too. So if you're a podcaster, you don't have that big number over your show, you feel horrible because the downloads, like the people who are downloading your show every episode, it changes, it ebbs and flows. But you don't get to see that if you're a podcaster. So my rant's over on that, but it's just if you're a podcaster and you're frustrated because your numbers haven't gone up, understand that your total audience actually has probably grown the whole time.
My wife is always telling me, because I'm always discouraged about, the lack of growth or the lack of rate of growth or whatever. And she's like, so what you're telling me is you basically have an auditorium full of physicians who are listening to you every time. And that's not good enough, right? Because of course I'm comparing myself to other podcasters and I know we're doing better than me. But like, if you think about it, what it would be a large number, as you said, in many circumstances in podcasting, and it can be frustrating. So I appreciate that boost of confidence to all the podcasters out there, because the metrics are just different. Yeah.
One other analogy that has seen a hit with folks is, the NFL, I don't know if you're a sports fan, but the NFL, people tend to agree, has grown over the past 10 years, right? Like more people follow the NFL now than ever. The seating capacity at the stadiums has not changed. So it's still 70,000 people that watch every game.
Yeah.
Have they grown? Yes, right? It's okay that it's not the number of people who are paying attention at the same time hasn't grown. You still have grown.
I love it. I love it. So where can people find you?
Yeah. So, I mean, if they need help growing a podcast, the number one thing to do is to check out my masterclass, which goes a little bit more into detail of those 4 steps that I mentioned. It's at growtheshow.com/masterclass. Really easy to remember. There's also an email course. You can go to 12daysofpodcastgrowth.com, 12daysofpodcastgrowth.com. If you're not like the two of us and you don't mind a couple of emails in your inbox. So those are the 2 places to learn. Other than that, you can just check out the Grow the Show podcast. Wherever you hear my voice coming from right now, I'll be there and I can help you there every single week.
Amazing. And to my listeners, because of what Kevin said earlier, I want you to email me at brad@physiciansguidetodoctoring.com, because I want to speak to you about what you want to hear so I can figure out how I can grow the show based on his advice. So email me. We'll set up a time to talk so I can create the content that you want to hear. Kevin Chemidlin, thank you so much for your time and expertise.
Pleasure's all mine. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. So please share it or like it or comment on a social media post or write us a 5-star review. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.